we can provide you a link after the session, along with the PowerPoint and handouts and survey. So just sit back and relax and enjoy the show. Welcome to today's workshop. It's on ethics, transparency, and accountability for nonprofits. My name is Yvette Bello, and I'm representing the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. With me today to make this a great webinar experience is Betsy Johnson and Monica Kelly of the Foundation, and also our co-host, Daniel Alexander. Hello, Daniel, from the Hartford Public Library. We want to know who you are, so take a moment as you're settling in, and I'm going through my introductions and welcomes. Put your name in the chat and where you're coming from, your organization. Love to sort of see the roll call. And so we get to know who's in the room. Just your name and your organization would be good. I'm going to go over some Zoom room norms. Kind of feels like second nature now, right? We want to see you, so if possible, turn your camera on. We'd love to see those faces. Please keep yourself muted to minimize background noise and distractions. Raise your hand via the chat icon, the Zoom icon, or in your camera when you have a question. You could use the chat feature to ask questions as well. I'll be monitoring the chat and then teeing them up for Priya as we go along. And obviously during her question and answer times, you could totally, if you would like to ask your question, that would be the time you could unmute and go ahead and ask your question. We don't have any scheduled breaks during this session, so we're going to go right through. But if, the rule of thumb, if you need one, take one. We'll be here when you get back. We will have a survey. That link will be provided toward the end of the session. And please take the time. It's sort of our admission ticket. Take the time, share your thoughts on what you liked and what you hope we can do in the future. Before I introduce our presenter today, we'd like to do a poll to see who's in the room and understand who, what roles or what hats you're wearing today. So if we have the poll ready, just give that a minute. And feel free to answer. I'm going to keep going with our introduction as that percolates. Today, our presenter is Priya Morgenstern. Priya, gosh, what do we say about Priya? Priya has been the director of the Pro Bono Partnerships Connecticut program for about 14 years. She provides direct legal services to local nonprofits, connects nonprofits with volunteer attorneys, and also lectures and trains volunteer attorneys about nonprofit and tax-exempt organizational law. Priya is a member of the Connecticut Bar Association's Pro Bono Committee and is a fellow of the Connecticut Bar Connecticut Bar Foundation's James W. Cooper Fellows Program, established to honor leading members of the legal profession and the judiciary in Connecticut. Priya is a trusted partner of the Hartford Foundation and among many ways has impacted the foundation's work. One of the ways I'd like to highlight today is that she's a key member of our community, our small agency community partners group. So is Daniel Alexander. Just to make a mention, this group is made up of other capacity builders in the Hartford region. And as a group, we're focused on supporting smaller nonprofits, increase their organizational effectiveness in service to their mission. So without further ado, and with great pleasure, I introduce Priya Morgenstern.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I want to thank you, Yvette, and you, Daniel, and the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, and the Hartford Public Library for hosting these great workshops. And thank you, Betsy and Monica, for being sort of the power behind the throne and keeping everything going smoothly. We really appreciate that. So welcome, everybody. I'm very excited to be doing this program, and it is my hope that it is inspiring to you and really encourages all of us to really just try to lift up our community and serve it as best we can and do things, to the highest possible standard. I will be sharing along the way sort of examples of what not to do. I call it my parade of horribles. It's where you don't want to go. So hopefully that'll be interesting. But at the end of the day, I hope that the takeaway is that this is something we all can do, we all should do, we all want to do it, because there's just so many reasons to operate a community that operates from this really ethical place of integrity. And that's what we're all hoping for. So I did want to mention again that you will be receiving this PowerPoint and the handouts afterwards. Daniel will be sending those out to you. And I also urge you, if you have any questions, to please put them into the chat. Yvette will be tracking those for me. And if there's anything that's really timely, she'll ask me to address it right then and there. Otherwise, we'll just take breaks here and there. So I want to tell everybody about the Pro Bono Partnership. I see many of you already are clients or you know about us. But for those of you who don't, the Pro Bono Partnership is a 501c3 public charity, as you all are. And we operate a public interest law firm where all of our clients are nonprofit organizations. And our clients are all 501c3s who are working to make the world a better place, a more beautiful place. They serve the poor and disadvantaged. They provide social or human services. They work in the areas of justice, environmental protection, animal rights, you name arts, education, you name it. We have a very, very wide array of clients who are all wonderful. They're all really dear to my heart. Next slide, slide 3. So the kind of work that we do is non-litigation business and transactional work. So that means that the kind of work we do, this is slide 3, Monica, by the way, relates to corporate governance, contracts, compliance. We do a lot of HR work, real estate, intellectual property, tax. We do mergers, we do dissolutions. Bottom line is anything a business would need a lawyer for, a nonprofit needs a lawyer for. But historically, you don't have the resources to pay for lawyers. So what we do is we bring really top shelf legal skills and staff to you without you having to divert your precious resources from your charitable mission. And it's, as you imagine, it's a very robust program. We operate in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And since our formation, we've provided almost $19 million worth of free legal services to nonprofits. The next slide is very colorful and just shows you sort of the different kind of organizations that we have worked with. So let's go to slide 5, where we're just going to take a look at our agenda and see what it is that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about what do we mean by ethics, transparency, and accountability. I'll be going over with you the major ethical hotspots, and that's where I'll give you examples of what not to do. We will review laws that are applicable to this particular subject area, not all applicable laws to nonprofits. We'll talk about the role of the board. We'll talk about important policies and procedures and practices to have in place. And then we'll just mention at the very end some oversight agencies. All right, so the next slide, when we're talking about ethics, what we're really talking about are the moral principles that govern what a person does. It's their sense of what is right and wrong. And people have it. They sort of arrive with it. We believe that it is the overarching principle of everything we're going to be talking about here, and that transparency and accountability are like components. They're components of ethics and an ethical culture. So when we're talking about transparency, we're talking about to what extent what the organization does is apparent or visible to other people who are watching. And it is addressed, for the most part, through reporting and disclosure requirements, some of which might be mandatory, some of which might be discretionary. But I do want to mention 2 things as it relates to transparency. First of all, what I'm talking about here in general is assuming that we're talking about organizations that are not subject to FOIA. FOIA stands for the Freedom of Information Act. It applies to certain quasi-public private agencies or public agencies like boards of ed. They're subject to a very, very different and higher standard of transparency. So I'm not talking about that today. I just want to be clear on that. The other thing I want to mention as we're talking about transparency is the notion of discretion, the distinction between privacy and secrecy. I do want to say that The notion of transparency does not mean that a board of directors has to or should invite everybody who wants to come into one of its meetings. I actually believe that's a bad or a practice to be discouraged. So there's space for the board to deliberate and think in a safe space. And then there's opportunities to make it very apparent what the board has decided or what it's doing. Which brings us to accountability, which is the sense of being responsible for the actions that the organization has taken, being willing to explain your position. I describe it as ownership for the decisions and actions of the organization. And that's very much, the ability, if somebody was asking, why did you do this, for somebody to step up to a mic or to a reporter or to who's ever asking the question and say, we did this because we thought it made the best sense. It was the most responsible thing to do. It was the best for the community, but really own the decisions that the organization's made. And so that's sort of like the three-legged stool of what we're talking about here. Next slide. So a quote from Warren Buffett is, it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. And if you think about that, you'll do things differently. And I do think that's true. I think especially now with social media, it is absolutely the truth that bad news travels faster and further and sticks around longer than good news. So you really, when you think about the nonprofit's reputation as being its currency, it's really what you need to hold on to, because getting it back is so much harder than just holding on to it. And I will say that it's particularly important because I think you probably all know what a huge component of our GDP the nonprofit sector is. There was almost $470+ billion given to nonprofits last year. I mean, it's just huge. So we have a very important position of responsibility. And yet, at the same time, a study that was done in 2019 showed that only 62% of the population do not trust nonprofits to do the right thing. That astounded me, sort of hurt my feelings. And I felt badly to see that, because I know we all try so hard. But it's really, really important for us to keep trying and do this really, really well, because it's very, very important. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of factors that affect ethical conduct. Who we are as individuals and who those individuals are in the workplace, peer pressure, groupthink, lack of accountability. I mean, there's a number of things that play a role here. And by the way, there are whole studies, there's like whole disciplines of organizational behavior that really look at this stuff in depth. And if anybody's interested and has the time or the inclination, I would really urge you to check out the Stanford Social Innovation Review periodical. It's really got some very, very interesting articles in it about this. Anyway, bottom line is virtue begets virtue. The culture at the top really matters. It's so much easier to establish and maintain a culture of ethics than it is to try to clean up a mess and restore a culture or create one for the first time. So again, keep the standards high and just keep them there. Protect your reputation. The Ethics Resource Center categorizes an organization as having a strong ethical culture. Next slide, please, Monica. Where top management, including the board, leads with integrity, supervisors reinforce ethical conduct, the peers display a commitment to ethics, and ethics are really integrated in everything that the organization does. This is really an example of where trickle down actually really works. And you'll hear me talk about the board setting the tone at the top many times, because that's really, really important. But in organizations of this kind, you'll find that employees engage in less misconduct. They feel less pressure to compromise their ethics, and they're more likely to share their concerns because they don't fear retaliation from their leaders. So that's really sort of the culture and the environment that you want to create. Next slide, please. So here are the major sort of topics we're going to be covering during this part of the presentation. We're going to be talking about compensation in human resources, conflicts of interest, publications and solicitations and the importance of honesty there, financial integrity, investment, accountability, and then confidentiality and data protection. Now, those are not the only sort of dimensions of ethics. You know, there's diversity, inclusion, environmental sustainability, volunteerism, philanthropy. I mean, there's so many other things that sort of are touched or touch ethics, but these are the ones that we're going to focus on because they're a little bit more obvious, a little bit more discrete, more measurable, and things that we can do something about more readily. So again, we care about this. Why? Because we want to avoid bad publicity. Well, first of all, we care about it because it's the right thing to do, but we want to avoid bad publicity. We want to maybe attract good publicity. I will say, not that we're mercenary and that we want to be ethical because we'll get all sorts of kudos for it, but there are organizations that track ethical organizations and ethical companies and recognize them. And that can always be very, very nice. You may have heard of corporate social responsibility. A lot of big corporations have CSR staffs. It's what they do. They care about that sort of stuff. And then the final reason I think that we want to do the right thing as much as we can is to avoid unwanted legislation that is likely to have unintended consequences. And I feel like all it will take is one like big, really ugly scandal in Connecticut, and you'd have legislators sort of elbowing each other out of the way, try to pass some legislation to address the problem that might address the problem or might be poorly drafted or not quite get it. And it's going to affect all of us in ways that weren't intended. And so let's avoid that. All right, next slide, please. So first we'll talk about compensation and human resources. So the first thing I will say, this is the reality, for better or worse, we are never going to earn what we are worth in the nonprofit sector. We are always going to be underpaid compared to our compatriots who are doing similar work in the for-profit realm. That's just how it is. And so when we're talking about comparables, we're comparing salaries to other nonprofits of similar size and location and subject matter. And we have an issue of reality and perception also. So let me give you an example here. One of the examples I mentioned is the New York Public Library. So a number of years ago, the CEO of the public library was earning $800,000. That's a lot of money, but maybe not so much money when you consider what the budget of the library was and how many people worked there. Probably not out of line compared to something in the for-profit world, but a lot of money in the nonprofit world. This was back in 2009, by the way. A poet and essayist and critic, you might have heard of Katha Pollitt, got wind of this and was beside herself. She was furious, horrified, published op-ed pieces, essays, everything. She urged everybody in New York to stop supporting the New York Public Library, and they did. And it really affected the organization's fundraising capabilities. They had a PR nightmare on their hands. And that was something they had to deal with for a number of years. So, and then there's other examples of other organizations where, you know, I mean, none of us operate hospitals or universities, but when you think about their budgets and how many staff people they have and what those CEOs are earning, it's nothing compared to what the CEOs are earning at a company that makes widgets or airplanes or any other sort of hard goods. But that's just our reality that we need to deal with. Another sort of category or sort of topic within compensation and human resources to look at has to do with the perks we give or the perks we don't give, but that are taken by unethical CEOs. And this is one of the reasons why a board really needs to be awake and paying attention. You all might remember the situation with United Way of America. A guy named William Aramone was the CEO, and he was flying his mistress all over the country in a private jet, going to Las Vegas. I mean, doing things, they're so obviously wrong. It's hard to imagine how the board didn't know that that was going on. But the point that I'm making here is that was the United Way of America. That was a separate nonprofit. There were thousands, hundreds, maybe thousands of United Ways across the rest of the country, like the United Way of Hartford, the United Way of various communities. Those United Ways also suffered a black eye. And their reputations were tarnished completely unfairly and inappropriately by the behavior of this one guy. And it's taken them many, many years to restore their luster. The United Way's are awesome organizations. They shouldn't need to struggle from this. So that's another reason to keep your eye on what people in power are doing and taking advantage of the nonprofits. Hiring and oversight are other examples of places in which ethics clearly touch what we do. Hiring and oversight includes discrimination and harassment and interpersonal relationships. And that's why it's very, very important to have employment policies that are followed, that are alive, that people can relate to, that people are familiar with and understand, and that the staff believe the organization's committed to. Even travel reimbursement, or even where you have your conference in the before days when we were having conferences, you know, the place you go to have your conference might reflect something about the organization's values and ethics. Next slide, please, Monica. The next category of ethical hotspot would be conflicts of interest. And typically this has to do with doing business with an insider and whether or not somebody's benefiting personally from their relationship with the nonprofit. So another example here I like to share has to do with the Central Asia Institute. Maybe some of you heard of a book called 3 Cups of Tea, written by a guy named Greg Mortensen. He went to Pakistan a number of years ago and was involved with helping establish a bunch of schools for girls there. And he wrote a book. The story was compelling. It was terribly written, but it was a very interesting book. And a lot of people wanted to donate money to help support this effort. So he created an organization based in Montana, that's where he lived, called the Central Asia Institute. And people donated a lot of money thinking that they were donating money that was going to be used to help build girls' schools in Pakistan. In fact, a lot of that money was used to pay for Greg Mortensen to travel around the world hawking his book. And then the profits from that book went into his pocket, not to the Central Asia Institute. Well, this came to light. The Attorney General of Montana forced Mortensen to pay back $1 million to the organization, stripped him of his title, and cleared out the board completely. And it affected the ability of that organization to do the work it was supposed to do, because when people heard about it, the donations dried up, of course. Now it's a little bit back on track. It's got new leadership, but that's a very, very clear example of where an individual has basically cashed in on the goodwill and the reputation of a nonprofit to benefit themselves personally. That should not have happened. The board should not have allowed that to happen, but it did. And so the board was also cleared out. Next slide, please. Sort of a segue here in terms of publications and solicitations, what happened with Central Asia Institute. If people think that they're donating for something, that's what they should be donating for. So if an organization is soliciting donations to be used for, say, victims after 9/11, that's what the organization should be using the money for. And so an example of an organization that ran into problems there was the Red Cross after 9/11. They were soliciting money. You know, people wanted to give money to the situation, to victims, to anything, because we were all so horrified by what happened. And the Red Cross was bringing in a lot of money. Now, what it was doing, which is not inherently wrong, but what it was doing was putting aside over half of that money for future possible disasters, which was what it always did, not inappropriate. It was its usual business model, but that wasn't clear to people when it was soliciting donations. People absolutely thought that when they were giving money to the Red Cross, it was going to go to the victims. Again, when this came to light, even though what the Red Cross was doing was not wrong, it was consistent with previous behavior, the problem was when it was soliciting the donations, it wasn't being clear with people about what it was doing. So it had to issue a public policy, and it suffered a tarnished reputation, which they didn't do themselves any favors when a few years later, when there was Hurricane Sandy, and people understandably wanted to sort of peel back the onion a little bit and see what and how the money was being used. Their response at the time was, how we spend our money is a trade secret. That's not a response I would recommend that nonprofits use when somebody's asking how you're using money that's being donated by the general public. Anyway, next slide. Let's look at financial integrity. So this is obviously super important. You know, as we heard previously, the failure of the board to oversee an organization's finances can lead to criminal behavior, theft and embezzlement and other, you know, that's beyond unethical behavior. It's beyond the scope of this presentation, but it's only possible if the board's not paying attention, or in many boards' defense, often the CEO or the CFO, if they're clever, can report things in ways that are hiding what they're doing. But it's very, very important for the board to be asking questions and get reliable reports. Anyway, the board's responsibility involves fiscal engagement, looking at fiscal policies, making sure that funds are used properly, excuse me, that there's not waste or fraud, that gifts are being used as intended by donors, that the organization is not making loans to insiders. That's a bad idea. It's not illegal, but it's a bad idea. And then another way in which financial integrity and ethics sort of overlap has to do with development and fundraising, and whether or not the organization has gift policies in place, or any gift policies at all, that require where the money comes from to be consistent in some way with the organization's values. That's not a requirement. And I will tell you that there are plenty of people who believe that money is fungible. And if we take money from somebody who's not aligned with us, that's less money they have to do bad things, and it's more money we have to transform and use in ways that are beneficial. Other people feel that the money we raise and the people we take money from, whether they're individual donors or institutions, should align with our values, and that there's something, this fancy term, the ick factor, that I've used, where they just feel like, we don't want money from that person. And an example might be, if you're a health organization, would you want to take money from RJ Reynolds Tobacco Company? Some people might say yes, some people might say no, but the point is to be thoughtful about it and have a policy. I have some examples here. Just one is, I thought this was really funny. A number of years ago, the Stanford Institute for the Research on Women and Gender did decline a gift from the Playboy Foundation. However, the ACLU Women's Rights Project, accepted that donation. They have since reversed their position, declined it, and this was a number of years ago anyway, but just an example about how two different organizations, sort of similarly aligned, had different reactions to donors that wanted to support their work. Also, one thing that you got to watch for, especially if you're a larger, more prominent organization, is that a lot of companies try to green their image. You know, they want to affiliate with you and sort of get stamp of approval from your nonprofit because it makes them look like a more righteous corporation, and maybe they'll give you money for it. And you need to proceed carefully along those lines, because the money and the partnership can be valuable and worthwhile and beneficial, but you also can be being used. And so there's some thought that needs to be given there. And again, the money can be transformed and used by you for beneficial things, but you need to be thoughtful about it. So the ick factor also applies to investments. Let's look at the next slide, please. Slide 15. So that's the degree to which your organization's investment portfolio, to the extent you have one, reflects the organization's values. Again, if you were a health organization, would you want to buy stock in a tobacco company? Or if you're a gun violence prevention organization, you know, you're not going to invest your money in a gun company. But an example of, you know, a recent alignment has to do with the Rockefeller Foundation's divestment of all its fossil fuel holdings. This was, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago. The Rockefeller Foundation made its money on petroleum and oil. So I thought it was really an extraordinary statement on their part to divest completely from that. So that's just something for you to think about. Let's go to the next slide, please. Accountability and strategic management. That first bullet has a goof in it. It says confidentiality and data protection. Just ignore that. I'm sorry, it's a mistake. So this is the ethical imperative to make sure the organization acts consistent with its mission and that its mission aligns with what's needed in the community and that there's ways to evaluate success. And why is this an ethical issue? Because the question is it ethical to continue doing what you're doing just because it's what you've been doing if it's not providing any social benefit in the community? Sometimes an organization achieves its goals and maybe that organization is no longer needed and that organization should dissolve. Sometimes though, the organization has sort of just taken on its own momentum and the board is entrenched and the organization just carries on. And I'd argue that there's an ethical issue there to be looked at. Another aspect is using resources in a principled way and using the money so that it's well spent, not just well intentioned. And then finally, there's an accountability issue here to members, stakeholders, the community at large. And I will give you an example here of where leadership really fell down on the job. Has to do with the American Psychological Association, which unbeknownst to its members for a number of years, the leadership was working covertly with the Pentagon and the CIA to assist with torture. And when the members of the organization found out about this, they appropriately threw a fit, cleared out the board and senior management, and passed a number of resolutions and policy that explicitly prohibit members of the organization and the organization itself to participate in any way with torture. And then the other thing in terms of accountability and to the community itself, I would include here the sort of hope or expectation that an organization work collaboratively, not competitively, with other organizations in the community, and that it, you guys might want to take a look at something called purpose-driven leadership. It's a model that is a little bit more respectful and accountable to the communities in which we operate. And I think it slides nicely in here to help sort of establish and support an ethical culture at the top as well. And then this final slide, maybe a little bit less obviously connected to ethics, but the point here is that as we increasingly ask for, collect, maintain, and use, and sometimes in a limited way share confidential or private information, we need to honor and protect the privacy of our stakeholders, whether it's the beneficiaries of the work we do, or our donors or others. We need to have things in place to make sure that we are honoring that expectation and trust that the general public's placing in us. That's sort of the end of my parade of horribles, but I will tell you that on the handout that I gave to you, if you want to see more hair-raising examples of what not to do, the handout, one of the links is the University of San Francisco's has a set of case studies, and they're really fascinating, and you might want to take a look at those. All right, next slide, please. So what is in our toolkit to really try to establish and maintain and support and nurture a culture of ethics and integrity in our workplace? Well, we have a code of ethics and related policies that we might want to develop. We have compliance with laws and public disclosure, strong financial oversight, responsible fundraising, culture and training, and making it live, just making it real for everybody that we're working with. And we're going to come back to this after we discuss the laws and discuss board roles in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk briefly about the laws that apply to this topic. So these are not all the laws that apply to nonprofits. These are laws that apply to nonprofits that are relevant to ethics, accountability, and transparency. So, and the other thing I want to mention about laws is that they set the floor. They set the floor. Best practices and what we aspire to is often somewhat above that. So at the federal level, the first thing I want to mention is Sarbanes-Oxley, which sometimes it's called SOX. Many of you have heard of it. It's federal legislation that was passed a number of years ago in the wake of the WorldCom and Enron corporate debacles. Sarbanes-Oxley has somewhat limited applicability to nonprofits, really only the whistleblower and document destruction provisions directly apply to nonprofits. But what it did do is it created a ripple effect that really does affect us, because it said senior management and the board of directors can no longer just claim, we didn't know that was happening, and get away with it anymore. There's now much more a culture of accountability at the top, where the board and senior management really have an obligation, and there's an expectation that they know what's going on in their shop. So that's the way that that's affected nonprofits. The next source of applicable federal law is the Internal Revenue Code, which you're all familiar with. We are all 501c3 public charities, which means we're recognized as tax exempt by the Internal Revenue Code. And so there's certain prohibitions and rules that apply to us that we need to comply with. No private benefit or private inurement, can't engage in excess benefit transactions. That means conflict of interest transaction where somebody's making more money than they should be because they're an insider. We have to file Form 990s, which is the informational return. The next slide, I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And then we have disclosure requirements. If people ask to see our Form 990 or our application to the IRS, which is called the Form 1023, in most cases, we have an obligation to make that available. Either send a copy, invite them into the office to look at it, post it on our website, make sure that it's on some other website perhaps, but that's a real legal obligation, and failure to comply with that, theoretically anyway, has fines involved. And by the way, one thing I want to mention about disclosing or making your 990 available, there's a Schedule B, which is the list of donors. Nobody has access to that. In other words, the public disclosure version of your 990 has the Schedule B removed. Nobody has a right to see who your donors are other than the people on your board and the person who prepares your tax return. So please remember that. Don't just send one out willy-nilly with your list of donors. All right, let's look at the next slide, talking a little bit more about the 990 in detail. So there's 3 versions of the Form 990 that you use depending on the organization's size based on its assets and revenues. There's the 990, the full-on form, the 990EZ, which is a shorter, more abbreviated form, and then the 990N, which is also called the e-postcard, which is really for the smallest of the organizations. For the 990 and 990EZ, for those of you who prepare those and look at them, you will note, and I'm sure you've noticed, that there are many questions that relate to governance, such as, do you have an independent board, or are people on your board related to each other? Do you give loans or take loans from people on your board? Do you maintain minutes? Does your board review the 990 before it's submitted? Does your board review the compensation of your ED before you decide on it? Do you have various corporate governance policies in place? These are questions that when the IRS first inserted these into the 990, it's maybe about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, a lot of people had a fit. They're like, it's none of the business of the IRS, how we govern. But the IRS's position is that good governance goes to compliance and ethics relates to good governance. So that's how this is all tied together. So bottom line is, there's no official right or wrong answer to these questions, but the real answer is yes, you should have these policies in place. Yes, your board should review compensation. Yes, your board should review the 990 before it goes in. So urge you to take a look at that. And then one other comment on the 990, there is a Schedule O, which, remember, this document is a public document. It's a place where the organization can do a little bit of PR and describe your programs, describe what you do in a little bit more detail if you think that will be helpful, you know, maybe with grant applications or something like that. All right, let's look at the next slide, which is applicable laws at the state level. So there's the Connecticut Revised Non-Stock Corporation Act. It governs nonprofit governance and operation. It is a very loosey-goosey set of statutes. There's really relatively few requirements and relatively few prohibitions. But generally, it provides guardrails for how your organization governs and operates. It provides a standard of conduct, which we'll talk about in a minute. It addresses director liability, indemnification, exposure to monetary liability, talks about conflicting interest transactions. All of these concepts, by the way, the pro bono partnership, we do a fair amount of work in the corporate governance space, and our template documents have been drafted to reflect not just what's required and prohibited, but also best practices along these ways, just so that you know that. At the state level, there's also charitable solicitation rules that govern. Charitable solicitation is just a fancy word for fundraising. Organizations that are engaged in fundraising in the state are supposed to register with the Department of Consumer Protection. There are exemptions for certain types of organizations, including very small ones of under $50,000 a year in charitable donations. But otherwise, you need to register. You need to renew the registration every year. If your organization has revenues over $500,000, you also have to submit audited financials to the Department of Consumer Protection. If you engage in charitable promotions, which are also called commercial co-ventures, you're supposed to submit your contracts. So there's a lot of rules there around charitable solicitation. And I will tell you that relatively few organizations know about them and comply with them, but those rules are out there. Next slide, please, Monica. So the standard of conduct for individual directors, I noticed that maybe about a third of the people on the call are in their role as directors. And so while language may vary state to state, every single state does provide standard of conduct that's expected from directors. Often it's described as the duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. I know the word obedience, I don't like that formulation so much, but the way that it's set forth in Connecticut is that a director is expected to discharge their duties in good faith, in a manner that he or she reasonably believes to be in the best interests of the organization, and with a level of care that another reasonably prudent person would demonstrate in a similar circumstance. So when you add that all together, what it means is you don't have to be the sharpest tool in the shed, but it doesn't mean you got to be somewhere above asleep at the wheel. So that's what we expect from people who are on a board. And if you meet that standard, by the way, there are certain statutory protections from liability that are afforded to you as a director on a board. So that's an additional reason to comply with that standard. And by the way, the prohibition or the belief that the director has to act in the best interest of the corporation, that's the source of the conflict of interest prohibitions and rules that we've mentioned and that we'll talk about again down the road. Right, next slide. So here's a list of the standard or typical responsibilities of a board of directors. I usually do a 2-hour presentation about this alone, so I am not going to drill down in detail on a lot of this stuff. What I will point out is that the ones that I've bolded on the slide are the ones that I think are most directly applicable to what we're talking about today. Doesn't mean they're the most important, it's just those dovetail the most with ethics, transparency, and accountability. And I'll also say that, at least for a somewhat larger organization or a more mature organization in its life cycle, using committees at the board level to address a lot of these, such as an HR committee, a governance committee, an audit committee, an investment committee, can be a very, very useful and effective and efficient way to stay on top of these issues and keep an eye on them, because board oversight is so critical. And we saw that to that parade of horribles, how important it is for the board to be awake and aware. Next slide, please. So let's talk about policies and practices, which is sort of where we pull together the laws, the rules, best practices, common sense, the toolkit that we mentioned. This is where we pull it all together and ideally set a tone that clarifies expectations, that lets people know we really care about this, that reinforces our core values. And then along the way, we are reducing our risk of legal liability and other kinds of harm. So it makes a lot of sense to do this. But importantly, do the people who are subject to these policies and procedures and practices, do they believe that they're real? Or do they just believe it's something that's in a binder on a shelf somewhere that they don't have to worry about? Next slide, please. So let's go through, there's sort of a hierarchy of policies. There's ones that we consider essential written policies, and then there's others that are important that we might urge you to consider. Some get written, some get shared, some are just embodied somehow. But let's start with the essential written policies, which, by the way, again, the Pro Bono Partnership can help with those. We'll go over each of those, but bottom line is a code of conduct of any kind is most effective if it focuses on inspiring compliance and urging people to self-govern themselves and try to comply with these guidelines, as opposed to focusing on punishment. Those are the ones that are generally the most effective. I'll also say that for a number of these policies, the extent to which you invited other stakeholders to help develop those policies, maybe a cross-section of board, management, staff to work on policies, you're going to have even more buy-in than you otherwise would. And so, you know, it might not always make sense, but if you can, that's also a really good practice, a really good thing to do. So next slide, let's look at conflict of interest policy, because that's probably the mother of all policies. It's really important. The IRS cares about this deeply. And if you have a policy and you follow it, it really will help you stay away from a lot of trouble. So what we consider best practice is that an organization have a conflict of interest policy that's a standalone policy. And then there's the annual disclosure statement that at the very least is executed every year by the board. In some organizations, it's also senior management, but certainly by the board of directors. So having a policy in place addresses the state requirements about conflicting interest transactions. It addresses the IRS's concern. It enables you to answer the question on the 990 in the affirmative that you have one. The IRS, by the way, has an example of a conflict of interest policy on their website that's very good, does the trick. You know it's compliant with them. So if you don't have a policy in place and you want to have one quickly, you can check that out. If it looks good, have your board adopt it and have a disclosure statement that's executed every year, acknowledging that people saw the policy, they agree to comply with it, and they disclose any conflicts that they might have. Also, I'll mention, the most obvious conflict of interest is where somebody on the board might be using their position in relation to the nonprofit to benefit themselves personally. There are also other kinds of conflicts that I would call more conflicts of loyalty. They're more subtle, where, for example, somebody might sit on the board of more than one nonprofit. Maybe they're both arts organizations. And then that person becomes aware of a grant opportunity for an art organization. Well, which organization that they're on the board of do they share that information with? Maybe both, maybe neither, maybe one. There's no policy that's going to address that, but a culture of integrity and a commitment to full disclosure would address something like that. And maybe that person would share that information with both organizations, or maybe that person would discover, you know what, I really do care about this organization more. I'm going to share it with this organization. Then maybe they would step down from the board of the other organization because they've seen that their loyalty is a little bit compromised. But anyway, that's an example of another sort of conflict that might not be addressed by conflict of interest policy. Let me just go over really fast the 5 key elements of a conflict of interest procedure, or what any board should go through if it's considering a transaction with somebody on the board that might benefit that person on the board. Whatever your policy says, or whether you have one in place, however long or short it is, the elements are that everybody on the board is aware that there's a potential conflict, that somebody on the board or somebody involved with this deal could stand to benefit personally from it. Okay. Second, the person who stands to potentially benefit does not participate in the vote approving that particular transaction. He or she could be invited by the board to participate in the conversation, maybe that director has something useful to say about why it might be best to use their services or buy their product or whatever it might be, but they're not to participate in the vote. Third, the board should do research to find out whether some other comparable, equally good or better product or service, whatever it is you're looking at, might be available to the organization without the potential conflict of interest at a comparable cost. So that's the research around comparables. Fourth, after all that's done, the board makes a determination that notwithstanding the potential conflict, it's still in the best interest of the organization to proceed to do this transaction with the inside person. And often it is. You know, my example is, let's say Joe owns an oil company and the organization needs to buy heating oil. Well, Joe's on the board. He cares about this organization. He might sell it to you for less than he sells it on the open market. So it would be beneficial to the organization to do that particular deal, okay? And then finally, you want minutes of that meeting to reflect that the organization just did all those steps. Did a question come in, Yvette, that I should address? I sort of saw it through the corner of my eye, or should we wait?
Yes, I was going to ask for clarification from Anna Astrid Molina. I'm not sure. Oh, so COI, conflict of interest. Here's the question. How about conflict of interest within the staff? Do you have an example for that?
Well, here's an example. I'm not sure if it's what Astrid has in mind, but let's say you have an organization that collects clothing and goods for people who are moving to their apartments for the first time, and it has it in a warehouse. In some organizations, I'm aware that staff feels like, well, they can go through this stuff first. They have sort of first dibs. They feel like they're not being paid a lot of money and the stuff is arriving and that's a nice coat and I need a coat. Now, the organization might be willing to do that, might have a policy about that, but probably would have a policy that says when people donate goods and services to this organization or goods and products, they think they're going to people who need them, not to staff. And so you really don't have access to that. So that might be an example of a conflict of interest where staffer is taking advantage of his or her position, working for the nonprofit to get some stuff for free that they wouldn't otherwise get.
A little bit of follow-up there, Priya. Think in this case, the employee may also be a contractor for the organization.
I'm not sure I follow. So they're an employee and a contractor? I don't understand that. Astrid, maybe you can send me a question afterwards, you and I can address it later. Is that okay? All right, because I'm not sure that I follow. Were there any other questions as long as I'm taking a break?
Not at this time, Priya, but Astrid, Anna Astrid did agree, yes. She'll follow up later.
Okay, very good. Okay, and then make sure that policy is reviewed and affirmed. Oh, here's another. Okay. This question relates to whether, you know, what are the implications if there's related people on a board of directors? The issue is not necessarily that there's a conflict of interest if there's related people on the board. It has more to do with the fact that if the board's small and some of the people on the board are related, they can create a voting block that then can engage in decision-making that might be more beneficial to certain people or the family than to the organization. There is nothing inherently wrong or illegal for there to be related people on a board. And sometimes the client will say to me, you know, well, I have this board, we're just getting started, it's 5 people and 2 of us are married. And the organization's just started, and my reaction might be, that's okay for now, but if you want to stay on the board with a married couple, the board better be bigger than 5 people, because otherwise they're almost a majority. You know, a married couple on a board that's 13 or 15 is very different than a married couple on a board of 4 or 5. It's still probably not ideal. You know, it's probably ideal for people on a board to not be related to each other in any way. But often, especially in a startup that's the group of people that's getting the nonprofit going. So, you know, I think a lot of what we're talking about too, like, you know, the realism overlay is where are you as an organization in your life cycle? So things that are expected from larger, more sophisticated, more mature organizations, it's a much higher and different standard than we expect from organizations that are just still scrambling to get their sea legs and get going. So, so there is a reality check there. So I hope that was helpful. Let's go to slide 27, please, Monica. How are we doing on time? Okay, good. All right. Whistleblower policy. Typically, a whistleblower policy relates to employment status. The idea is that if I'm on staff and I see something wrong and I blow the whistle on somebody or something, the organization I work for or the company I work for is prohibited from retaliating against me in an employment context by either demoting me, giving me a different job that I don't want to do, or somehow affecting my employment. However, in the context of nonprofits and ethics and accountability, I think we are inclined to think about whistleblowing a little bit broader, to the extent we as the board and senior management and organizations want to have more of an open door policy where we want to know if there's anything going on with our organization that's untoward or something that we should know about. And we welcome input, not just from employees, but also volunteers, vendors, donors, anybody who might have a sense that something inappropriate is going on. So the policy basically is ideally creating that culture, saying, we want to hear about it, we really do, and then providing sort of a chain or a reporting process or procedure. That's generally what we recommend. And I think it reflects well in the organization when you have that. And it's also a very effective way to learn whether or not the organization is doing anything that it shouldn't be doing. So again, it creates that culture and it enables people, especially employees who often see the most of the bad, to really feel comfortable if they can report that to somebody and not be retaliated against. Next slide, please. And so again, the executive compensation policy, this applies really mostly to the larger organizations that are paying serious money to their executives. For those organizations, it is really a critical policy to have. The policy needs to provide that the full board approves, does research, does comparables, is aware of the perks, total compensation package, all of that sort of stuff. I don't think a lot of those of us on the phone are in that category. So I am going to move on to the next slide, please. All right, so here's some other policies and practices that we can talk about. A code of ethics or a code of conduct. This is just a generic thing. There is no legal or official thing that it is, or that it's required or has required content. It's just something that an organization might decide to do. It might have overlap between whistleblower policies and other kinds of policies, but it's a kind of document that an organization can, if it wants to, put together that reflects the organization's values. And maybe you know, dismantling racism and inclusivity and diversity are like key values, and you want to document that everybody buys into, maybe people help create. And that's the document that you post on your website for everybody to see, one of the first things they do. And also it acts as a touchstone for decisions that an organization makes, for your grant applications, for your hiring decisions. It's really, you know, the place where all of the heart of the organization resides. It can be a really, really dynamic and important document, not required, but it could be something that's really good for the organization to consider putting together. And if you do, obviously it's something you want to be really proud of and that you put on your website. And there is an example, by the way, in the handout that you'll be receiving from me through Daniel. It's from Compass Point. Next slide, please. Some other policies and practices, you know, your fiscal policies and practices, internal financial controls. hopefully you have an accountant that you can be working with on this and your finance staff. And you want to have those policies and procedures in place. Unfortunately, there used to be an organization that had volunteer accountants that could help with this. They've gone AWOL, and Yvette and Daniel and I were actually talking the other day about trying to figure out a way to get it started again. We will keep you posted. It'd be great to have that as a resource again. But identifying who is responsible for doing what as money comes in and money goes out is absolutely key. Separating the responsibilities. You never, even in a baby organization, want to have one person responsible for receiving checks, depositing them, and making expenditures. It's just inviting monkey business. You really don't ever want to do that. In larger organizations, often, key finance people, when they go on vacation, they have to leave for at least 2 weeks because it gives the organization an opportunity to see, all right, does anything look different when they're not around? So, so that's something that you want to consider. Also, the board should absolutely be regularly reviewing the organization's financial status. Most often, that might be in the form of a quarterly budget to actual report, so that the board has an opportunity to see where we thought we would be at this point and where we really are, and make some course corrections. Strongly recommend that. So that's a budget to actual report. And then finally, the board, of course, is going to be reviewing the 990 before it goes in. A lot of directors, their eyes will glaze over when they look at the 990, so it can be helpful to have somebody who's familiar with it sort of walk them through it. But it's a really, really interesting document for directors to review, because it'll help you understand the organization better than you otherwise would if you didn't see it. And then audits, I'm imagining most of the organizations on the phone are not subject to these audits, but if you receive over $500,000 in charitable donations in a year, you are required to submit audited financials to the Department of Consumer Protection. We are hoping to raise that threshold at some point in the future. It was raised a few years ago from 200,000 to 500,000. The reason being that audits are very expensive. And, they're $10,000, $12,000, and that's real money to organizations that are trying to do good stuff with that money. So we believe the trigger or the threshold should be higher. So stay tuned on that. Hopefully we will change that for all of us. Next slide. I think we're okay on time. So some other policies that you can consider, or maybe that you have in place: a reimbursement policy that might go to travel expenses. Should be reasonable. We don't want people flying first class, typically for a nonprofit, or staying in the fanciest hotels. They don't have to stay in flea bags either, but there needs to be some sort of sense that the decisions that are made by some person as to how they fly, let's say, or where they go, is being overseen by somebody else that's going to bring sort of a reasonableness standard to that review. You definitely want to be reimbursing people for their travel expenses. The IRS has a standard reimbursement amount for mileage. And by the way, there's a huge differential between the reimbursement rate for an employee as opposed to a volunteer. So if you're driving as an employee, you should be getting, it's 58.5 cents a mile. If you're a volunteer, sorry, it's only 14 cents. Shows how little we value volunteerism in this country, unfortunately, but that's that. Gift acceptance policy, this sort of circles back and connects to what we were talking about earlier about the form in which you accept gifts and the donors from whom you'll accept gifts. It also goes to sometimes individual staff people have such a connection with somebody that somebody might want to give them a gift. And maybe the organization would have a policy that individuals can receive de minimis gifts, but not significant gifts. I worked for a company where, we had people who wanted to give us, they gave us baskets of food and chocolates and all that sort of stuff. We had to give them away. We couldn't even keep those. So the organization should think in terms of a policy. Maybe the policy is, if you get a basket of food, you can't keep it personally. You have to share it with everybody in the workplace. That's another approach that you can do there with that. And finally, it's good to have a written policy in place, because if you do have to reject or decline the gift, you can explain to the donor that there's a policy in place and you're so sorry, but you can't accept the gifts. And that would be less offensive to them. Next slide, please. Document retention policy. We at the Pro Bono Partnership can help with this. We recommend a document retention policy that does not include mandatory destruction timeframes. We're all too busy, for crying out loud, to be combing through files looking for papers that are older than a certain date and then having to shred them. Forget it. But we are going to know that there's certain documents we need to keep for at least some period of time that makes sense, so that if we do then want to clear out some filing cabinets and throw things away, we have a schedule, we have a time frame. We can look at something and say, oh, this is from an HR file and this is over X years old. Let me see if I can look at the schedule. Yeah, I can get rid of this now. And so it's defensible that you've done that. I'm sorry, did Priya mention? Priya mentioned that there used to be a pro bono finance and accounting resource that no longer exists, unfortunately. But we'll see if we can, we'll see if we can try to get something like that going again. It was really useful. It's called CAS, Community Accounting Services.
Priya, just another question. I wanted to check in. D&O insurance, directors and officer insurance, required, strongly encouraged, mandatory? What are you thinking?
Great question. I'm sorry. I've been like, ugh. I should have taken a break for questions.
Oh, no worries. No worries.
I think that's a great question. It is not mandatory in most cases. There may be, the business you're in might require that you have certain kinds of insurance. But it is certainly recommended. And here's why, especially if you have employees. Here's the thing, there are corporate protections for directors and officers. You know, the corporate form protects you. There are state statutes. There's the business judgment rule. There's the Good Samaritan Act. There's the Federal Volunteer Protection Act. These all provide various kinds of legal protections to people who are on boards, unpaid positions on boards, or who are officers of organizations. But here's the thing. Let's say an organization agrees to indemnify anybody on the board who's sued for something they did as a director. Indemnification means the organization is committed to get your back. You know, they're not going to leave you out to dry and pay for all the expenses yourself if you're being sued, and if you are found liable and there's damages, the organization agrees to make you whole. But what if the organization doesn't have the money to do that? And that's what D&O provides. D&O provides the financial support for the commitments that an organization makes to protect its directors and officers. So I strongly urge organizations to have D&O insurance. You know, if a teeny baby organization that doesn't have employees and isn't engaging in risky activities doesn't have D&O insurance for the first few years, I can sleep. But as soon as the organization has an employee, the risk of suit goes up, because most lawsuits against nonprofits come from aggrieved employees or former employees. And the insurance that you would get to protect the organization against those lawsuits, it's called EPLI, Employment Protection Liability Insurance. Those coverages only come if you have D&O coverage as well. So that's why you have to have D&O coverage as soon as you have an employee, in my opinion. The other reason to have D&O coverage is because if you want anybody on your board who's a high wealth individual, they're never going to join a board that doesn't have D&O coverage, because God forbid the organization gets sued, they're going to go after the deepest pocket. And if that person's the deepest pocket, they don't want to be in that situation. So to wrap up, D&O insurance is strongly recommended. For example, also Leadership Greater Hartford, you know, that great Leaders on Board program they have where they sort of do speed dating and try to place people on boards. You have to have D&O insurance to qualify to participate in that program. So anyway, so that's the long-winded answer. Happy to address more specific questions. We good? Keep going. So document retention. Okay. Confidentiality policy. This again ties into something we mentioned previously. The information that an organization collects could be proprietary to it, could be personal or personal identifiable information to the individual that shared it. And the organization should have policies. Maybe there's locked cabinets where the HR files are kept, or maybe there are certain rules that you use about what you share, about who donated what. There's also, sort of industry-wide cultures. For example, in the theater, it seems to be commonplace that you share sort of the level that people have donated. I think we've all seen playbills where at the back it lists donors over $10,000, between $5,000 and $10,000, and lists people's names. People always should have the option of choosing anonymous, but that's a culture where people expect other people to know how much they've donated. In other contexts, in almost all other contexts, that's very unusual. So you want to protect that information. Another example of confidentiality policies would be industry specific, HIPAA obviously, but let's say you run a childcare center. You don't want parents or teachers taking pictures of the kids and posting them. You don't want other children's kids on somebody else's Facebook page. So that's an example of a confidentiality policy that you might have in place. Investment policy, again, so we talked about that a little bit earlier about where you invest your dollars and making sure, if this matters to you, that they align with the organization's values and are reflective of what you believe should be in the world. It's that simple. Next slide, please. Statement of core values, that's very similar to code of ethics. It's just a place where you can sort of crystallize what really matters to the organization. These are sort of just practices now that foster an environment of integrity. I would also say voluntary disclosure on your website of key documents is also really, it's a breath of fresh air. Increasingly, organizations are doing it. I think you're announcing to the world, here's our 990, here's our annual report, here's this, here's that, this is what we care about, and really being forthright about the organization and what matters to it. I would say, I would also urge you, I'm sorry, let me go back to voluntary disclosure of the 990 on the website. In addition to making sure that it's available if somebody asks for it, putting it on the website makes it much easier for you, because if somebody asks for a copy, you can say to them, it's already on the website, we don't have to mail it to you. But if it's not on the website, you might have to make a copy and mail it to them. So that's important. Let me get to that question in a second. And then finally, the one thing that I think, maybe this is just a personal thing of mine, I really believe that organizations should list in a very easy to find place the people that are on their board of directors and their staff. Very often, I want to know who's behind the organization, who's working there. They're people I know, people I've heard of, people I trust. And it's really, really important information. And sometimes it's just absolutely buried. And sometimes it's just not there at all. And again, this isn't a legal requirement. It's just something that I'm recommending as, somebody who's been in this world is what, I think many of us would consider a best practice. What was the question that just,
Yeah, so two kind of related questions. So, and Lewis is asking, so organizations should have parents to sign release forms. If so, does it need to be executed by each event? You want the second one too, kind of similar?
Sure.
Is it okay to write up a photo waiver when participating in an event?
Okay. So there is a real distinction to my mind between photo releases that are specific to a kind of use and limited to the person who can use it versus, and I'm not sure if this is what the person asking the question was asking about, there's no kind of release that a parent could sign that, in my opinion, would permit some other parent to take a photo and post it on their Facebook page, or a teacher to do that. However, let's say the child care center wants to use children's photos in its pamphlet or annual report. and it takes certain photos that are really particularly cute and wants to use those photos, it would seek written permission from the parent of that child to use that photo of that child for that particular purpose. That's fine. Or maybe there's an event. But again, a release, an image release has to be very narrowly crafted, very narrowly used, and very time limited. I hope that answers the question. All right.
Looks like it.
Okay, thanks. Next slide, slide 34, please. Like at a festival. Museum, I'm not sure. I think what Nazim is asking is if, first of all, if it involves kids, it's a whole different kettle of fish. All right. If you go to a festival, maybe this was the question, and you don't care who takes your picture and you don't care where it shows up. And maybe the back of the ticket says, this constitutes your permission for us to take pictures and post them wherever we want. That might be one thing, but if it relates to children, it's a whole different story, I think. Okay. So anyway, so let's talk just a few more other practices that I think foster an environment of integrity. So honesty and solicitation materials, I can't tell you how important this is. It's fundraising communications, it's communications about how you use the money. It's the organization's obligation to watch what its fundraisers are doing very carefully. You don't want to say to people, here, raise money for us. Let it rip. We don't care what you do. We do care what you do. And we want to keep an eye on it. And by the way, you know, back when I was talking about registrations and stuff with the Department of Consumer Protection, if you hire fundraising counsel or a paid fundraiser, you are supposed to enter into a written contract with that person or company and file it with the Department of Consumer Protection. Again, I'm just saying most organizations don't know this and probably don't do it, but there is theoretically oversight on that. The next one is strong communication with employees and volunteers, and I would add, and the community. It's really, really important that people know what you're doing and believe in what you're doing. So, you know, I know that there's times when it can be a little bit tricky to share tons of information with your staff. You know, there's a concern, certainly, if there's going to be a merger or something happening, you just don't want people to jump ship. And so you have to time things and be very careful. But for the most part, if your staff can trust that you're going to let them know what they need to know, you're creating a better workplace. It's idealistic, I know that, but it's possible. It really, really is. And, you know, let the community in on what you're doing. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not a fan of inviting the community into your board meetings, because I believe the board needs a space to do its evaluation and deliberations in a safe space. Again, unless your corporate governance documents say otherwise, or there's something else about your business. However, an organization can host periodic community meetings. Invite the community in, seek their input, see what it is that matters to them, get a sense of how well you're doing in the community. Well, how are you perceived? You know, if the organization is perceived as not responsive, you want to know that. Somebody just mentioned sunshine laws. They do not apply to most nonprofits, June. Sunshine laws apply to organizations that are subject to the Freedom of Information Act, or specifically the sunshine laws, but those do not apply to most nonprofit organizations. But anyway, periodic public meetings is a really good way to share information with the community and seek input from the community. All right, next slide. We're almost finished. Make sure the organization is following its mission. Ideally, the certificate of incorporation has described what it is the organization does in a very general sense, in a way that allows some evolution or morphing. I don't believe that the organization's mission statement needs to be in the certificate of incorporation or bylaws. Sometimes we have people, you know, mission statement might be refined every few years. It doesn't mean you have to amend your certificate of incorporation every few years to reflect that new mission statement. Ideally, the certificate of incorporation was drafted broadly enough to encompass that, as it may change a little bit over time. Another thing you might want to consider doing is an ethics audit just an idea from the National Council of Nonprofits. It might be an opportunity to, again, pull together a cross-sectional team of people to work on something like that. It might be a cool exercise, not required, but it might be something that, you know, your organization might want to consider, especially for things that would like do really, really well and want to be able to brag about the results. And then communicating with other nonprofits. I think that's another thing that, you know, I mentioned this earlier, working collaboratively with your fellow nonprofits in the community might even mean sometimes holding back on something to enable another organization to move forward and get maybe more money or recognition or something like that. That can be really, really useful. Last slide, please. So this is a list of who's out there watching what we do as a community. So it's the IRS, it's the Attorney General of the state or states in which you operate, the Department of Consumer Protection. It's not always called that in every other state. Here it's the DCP, but every state does have an agency that governs charities. So if you operate in other states, you might be subject to those rules as well. Better Business Bureau has something called the Wise Giving Alliance that's specific to nonprofits. There's Charity Navigator, Charity Watch, and GuideStar. So that's it for the presentation. And I want to thank Daniel and Yvette and Monica and Betsy again for all their help on this presentation. Thank you to the Hartford Foundation and the Public Giving for hosting an awesome series of webinars for our community. The Pro Bono Partnership stands ready to help you guys with, you know, legal issues that you might need help with. And I want to thank all of you for all the awesome work you're doing in the community. That's it. Any questions that I should grab at this point?
Well, we have some people just saying thank you in the chat. If anybody would like to unmute, this is your time to sort of ask your question.
Yeah, I'll stay put for a while.
Sure. So as people are thinking about their question, I will point out that the survey link was shared in our chat. Please, 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 that's 3 pleases. Please, please, please fill them out. You know, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you, Betsy, for putting them up there. Thank you all for being here. You know, thank you on behalf of the team at the Hartford Foundation at the Hartford Public Library. Thank you, Priya, for taking the invitation to share more and your expertise and your time around this topic. I think lots of ears were perked up. Someone's asking about the slides, the handouts, the recording, the survey, just in case you didn't do it, but I asked 3 times, please. So you're going to do it, but all of those things will be forwarded and sent in an email to all registrants. We do have a question about, can you speak more on soliciting funds and honesty about intended use? So just going to flag that.
Sure. I can address that and let me know, you know, have a conversation with me if I'm not addressing it. So the critical thing, it's very important for a nonprofit organization, if it's soliciting money for a particular purpose, to use it for that purpose, which is why what we call sort of unrestricted funds, it's like the holy grail of money that a nonprofit can receive. So the nonprofit just says, we need money to do what we're doing. Give us money to help us do what we do in the community. That's awesome, because any money you get, you can use however you want. Back bills, hire new staff, build a building, whatever it might be. But if you have, say, a capital campaign that says, we need to build a gym at this Boys and Girls Club. So we're doing a capital campaign. We want to raise $5 million to build a gym. And somebody gives you a check in response to that campaign. You cannot use that money to pay your electrical bill because you solicited it for a particular purpose. So you need to be very, very careful about what you say and what comes in response to that. Sometimes it's not super obvious that somebody, what if somebody just sent a check and didn't say what it was for, but it was, in terms of time, really on the heels of a capital campaign solicitation? Well, you better be cautious there, okay, in that situation. Or what I see often, you know, if you don't donate online, sometimes organizations will give you the option of donating for general operating support or for this specific purpose or for that, and you can indicate it, well, you better have bookkeeping capacity in place to keep track of all that. Now, what happens if you get a donation that was intended for one thing and you use it for something else? Bad. But the person who gave you the money does not have standing to sue your organization. He or she or it has to go to the Attorney General and convince them to bring a lawsuit against the nonprofit organization. So what that means in real life is it's really only going to happen if it's a lot of money and or a very prominent donor. So it doesn't mean all bets are off, but it means that if I gave $100,000 to UConn to do something and I determined that they did something else with it, I'd have to go to the Attorney General. And because it's $100,000 and because it's UConn, maybe the Attorney General would look into it and do something about it. Okay, I hope I got the answer there.
Thank you for that, Priya. Just a follow-up here is responding to an RFP solicitation for purposes of a charitable organization registration.
That's such a tough question. What a great
question. I know.
It depends on the state where the grant application is going. I mean, I think from a policy perspective, the idea of charitable solicitation is to protect citizens from being scammed. Okay, so it's designed to protect unsophisticated people from being ripped off and donating money to sham charities or being fleeced. I believe that when an organization submits a formal grant application to an institutional funder, that purpose is not served. Okay. However, there are some states that do believe that a grant application coming into that state, which is sort of like almost nonsensical when we have the internet, is a solicitation in that state. So that's why that question is great, but also impossible to answer.
I asked you an impossible question, Priya.
That was you, Anne? I should have known.
So this is a good segue, right? For the Priya and also her staff attorney, Sarah Taylor, are available to sort of get into your organization's particulars. So certainly you saw their information. It'll be in the documents that we send to you after this webinar. I want to just acknowledge everybody's time, and we're about 3 minutes out. I do want to just mention, for those of you that stuck around, the next session in our workshop series might be of interest. The name of it is the DEI Marathon: How to Stay Engaged and Make Measurable Progress on the Journey to Inclusion. Now, I think this is a great topic. I think it's probably on the minds of a lot of nonprofits. It's definitely on the mind of the Hartford Foundation. And we'd love to see as many of you that are still on and others join us for that conversation. No matter where you are in that journey, I think come with an open mind and come with your questions. And if I know anything about this group and my my frequent flyers here, you'll come with questions. So with that being said, unless there's another question, and I don't see anything in the link, I'm sorry, in the chat. Thank you, Betsy, for posting the link in the chat for the upcoming sessions. Not seeing anything. I'd love to wish everybody a happy rest of their day. Go out, get some vitamin D.
Yeah.
The sun is poking out, so it'll be gone soon. Run. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much, everybody.